Hello everyone and welcome back to Kobean History. In today's episode we will have a look at the different parts and features of a castle wall and what they were used for. We'll start with the broader terms and then move inwards to the more specific features. Enceinte is a broad term. It refers to the towers and walls encircling a fortification, so it doesn't necessarily need to be a castle. So it's a collective term for both the towers and the curtain walls surrounding the castle. The towers are for another video. Today I will focus on the curtain walls, which is a part of the enceinte in between the towers. If we have a look at the inside of a wall, we can see on both sides it's a nice masonry finish. But if we look on the inside of the wall, the filling is more of a collection of rougher stones and the mortar to hold it all together. On the outer layer of the wall, it was usually whitewashed to give the castle a nicer appearance, and this was done throughout the castle on all the different buildings. Whitewashing they did using lime, and if you're interested in how that was made, you can watch my video on the quicklime burner. I'll put a link at the end of the video. Now we will go to the top of the wall, to the ramparts. Ramparts are a general term. It doesn't necessarily need to refer to stone walls. So another word to refer to this part where the people would walk on is the wall walk. So this protruding smaller wall that protects the wall walk is referred to as the battlements, or you can also call it the parapet. Or if you're going off of the specific design of it, you can call it crenelations as well, which we will have a closer look at now. So these are crenelations and they consist of different parts. You have the merlons, which stick out from the top. Then the lower parts of the wall are the crenels. And then we also have a name for the empty space in between the merlons, which are called embrasures. And sometimes inside these embrasures, shutters were built. So they had more defense throughout, and they could open them in case they had to shoot arrows and close them if they wanted more defense. In the late 12th century we also see the appearance of arrow loops built inside of the merlons, which allowed them to be covered while they were shooting arrows, instead of hiding behind the merlons while they were getting ready and popping out of the embrasures when they wanted to fire. And now with these arrow loops inside of the merlons, they had cover as well as the ability to fire. You can also see that on the outside the arrow slits are quite narrow, but from the inside there is a wider wedge shape, allowing the defender to shoot from different angles and have a wider range. Many crenelations we see today are reconstructions, and in later centuries they were also built as an aesthetic feature, not to be functional. So the crenelations we see on different buildings aren't always functional. So next up we have hoardings. Hoardings were a wooden structure that was added on top of the wall for extra defense. And it was built to lean over the walls, so they had more angles of fire, and also a way to fire on enemies below them at the foot of the wall if the attackers made it that far. There were quite a few different types of hoardings and also different ways of attaching them to the top of the wall. They could just be placed on the very top of the wall, or even a little higher at the height of the parapet, so people could lean over them to shoot down or forwards. Or if there were arrow loops in the merlons, those holes could be used to support the beams as well to build the structure. But we also see that some castles had built-in slots inside of the wall, built specifically to support wooden beams of hoardings. This is the type you see pictures of on screen right now. So in this case they would have to go through the embrasures in between the merlons to get to the hoardings. There were also more ways to build hoardings, but we won't go into that in this video. Now there is a possible misconception about hoardings, that because of the fact that they were made out of wood, they were only temporary. But this is just an assumption, probably because we don't really see hoardings on medieval castles anymore today, because the wood has already long rotten away. But yeah, it's more likely that hoardings were built and then left there in case the need arises, instead of building and taking them down again every time an attacking force is nearby, because some hoardings could last for years or even decades, still being structurally sound. Later on, a stone feature developed, taking the same use as hoardings. These features are called Machicolations, and like Hoardings, their aim was to be able to fire upon enemies below them at the base of the wall. Machicolations were used in a variety of forms as well. You had the standard ones just at the bottom of the parapet on top of the wall. You also had them built into more protective walls, which were covered at the top. Or they could even be implemented in a lower section of the wall and not at the very top. Now these protrusions that would support the parapet above are called corbels. Corbels were used throughout history, so they're not exclusive to castles or castle walls. These were common types of machicolations, but there are also some more unusual varieties, like the surarch machicolations. They weren't very common, but one example of them can be found at Chateau Gaillard. Now as you can see, these machicolations were quite long, and instead of protruding out of the wall on the top, they are more similar to indents. Now there is a disadvantage to these, because you'd have a blind spot in between the bases of the arches in between the machicolations. But these unusual machicolations did incorporate a feature that we will talk about next, which is this slanted area over here. In the common castle, these would be at the base of the wall, and they're called batters or taluses or plinths. They have multiple names. But what it comes down to is that at the base of the wall is a bit wider and it has this little slant at the bottom. These plinths had a variety of uses, but we will start with the use incorporating the machicolations above. Because the first use is when you drop down items from the machicolations above, it would hit these slanted parts, and the rock or whatever they threw down would bounce off of it in a forward direction towards the enemy, giving these projectiles a greater range. Another use of it was to strengthen the wall itself. Because it was wider at the base, the weight of the wall would be distributed more, and this helped to counteract the practice of undermining, where the enemy force would dig a tunnel underneath the wall and then try to collapse it that way by making it unstable. Also, with other siege tactics, it would make it more difficult, because most conventional siege weapons were built to lean up against the wall, like siege towers or ladders. Now to come back to Machicolations, we also had a similar structure called the Brattice. Unlike Machicolations, which would usually run the length of the wall or surround the whole tower, a Brattice was a localized defense, using the same strategy as Machicolations to throw projectiles or shoot down from a hole aimed below them. And Brattices were built inside of the walls. A Brattice also looked quite similar to another feature you'd find inside of a castle, which would shoot out another kind of projectile. That would be the guard-rope or privy, which was a latrine. Now luckily there is a way to tell the difference. A guard-rope would usually be in the inner parts of a castle where the residence was, not on the outer defensive wall. Also, a Brattice would usually be constructed above a window or a doorway, because that's where it would be most useful to defend the weak points where the enemy would try to get into the castle. And for obvious reasons, the guard rope would tend to not be above a window or a doorway. Now that was enough talk about latrines, so we'll get back to the castle wall. So as mentioned earlier, the Brattice would be built inside of a wall, but a similar structure could be constructed at the top of the wall, and this would be called a Bartizan. Now on this picture you can see some Bartizans, and below them you see kind of supports built inside of the wall. These supports are called buttresses, and they don't necessarily need to be there for the Bartizans to be there, but could also be generally constructed on the face of a wall to strengthen it as well. You also had bastions. Nowadays when we hear bastions we usually think of the artillery bastions. But these later artillery bastions had their origin in the bastions of medieval castles, which would have looked something like this. Now the last feature of a castle wall that I want to talk about is a feature that I don't hear mentioned that much. And before I researched this video, I didn't even know that was a specific feature of a castle. Some castles would have a shield wall, which was a higher portion of wall, a lot higher than the surrounding walls, and this could be built to protect a building on the other side of it, or to have one part of the wall where it was extra fortified. So that was it for this episode. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And on screen right now you can find my Anatomy of Castles playlist, where you'll find more videos like this one. Or if you're interested in history as a whole, you can check out my channel to find a variety of topics.